Thank you very much, Rob. Can you see my shared screen okay?
That we're good.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to virtually come to Melrose to talk about the new museum. I feel slightly shortchanged that I don't get a meal at works out of it afterwards, but I guess I can live with that. What I was asked to do was to give, if you like, my top 10 of what the new museum is going to contain. This is, of course, impossible because there is so much wonderful material in the new displays. This is an absolutely and entirely biased selection based on things that have caught my eye as the process of working with the Trust on the museum has proceeded. We have... Why is that not moving? I work for the National Museum. I'm the Iron Age and Roman curator there. And it's been my great good fortune to work with the Trust really since I started at the museum more years ago than I care to remember. And in fact, since the late 1980s, the National Museum and the Trust have been working in partnership to present the story of Trimontium, of Roman Newstead. This story is too good to be told in only one place. So it's the fundamental Roman site in the national collections, a key part of our displays, as well as being the basis of the Trust displays in Melrose. So Trimontium, in my entirely biased view, is the most important site in Roman Scotland. Not just because it sits in an important strategic location, but really it's the great excavations by James Currell in particular in the early 20th century and the wonderful to tell the story of Roman Scotland. We're delighted at the National Museum to be able to support the latest incarnation of the museum, just as we've been able to support previous incarnations, building on all the good work that the Trust has done over the years. And this wonderful image by David Simon that the Trust commissioned gives you a sense of the wider Newstead landscape throughout the day. Of course, archaeologists love chronology and phases and the complex history of Trimontium and the many different ways in which its history changed over fully 150 years of frontier warfare. The fort went through lots of incarnations, and I'm not going to tell you about any of those tonight. No phases, no post holes, none of the boring stuff that archaeologists spend years of their lives blethering on about. Tonight is about objects, and in particular, some of the treasures that will be filling the museum in Trimontium, both old friends and new. Some that will be very familiar to people who have seen the museum before, some that have not been there before at all. How can I pick 10 objects? I will, of course, bend the rules. People always do in these circumstances, and I will show you more, but there are 10 key objects that I want to use to tell stories, the key stories within the all about storytelling. They give us insights into the lives of people on the Roman frontier. And that's what I'd like to dwell on tonight. So, without further ado, number one isn't even Roman at all. Because we need to remember, the Romans are just a passing presence in this landscape. There were people in the borders long before the Romans turned up. And to understand the Roman period, we need to understand the Iron Age. We need to understand the people who were living in that landscape when the Roman army came in. It was a busy landscape. You look at almost any border hill and it will have a hill fort on top of it. And these were the long-lived settlements of the Iron Age. And while in many cases the defences themselves had fallen from use by the Roman period, there were still settlements in these hill forts and in many other locations as well. But it gets a poor press. When you excavate a Roman site, your objects, your material is measured in wheelbarrows full. On an Iron Age site, it's measured in matchboxes. And this is not because the Iron Age is poverty-stricken. People were careful. It was a culture of recycling and reusing. It wasn't a throwaway culture like the Roman world was. So an Iron Age site is rare. What we find are things they wanted to preserve, things that had a special history, if you like. And this marvellous bronze armlet, which I'm showing you here, is one of those objects. It comes from Stichel, along the Tweed near Kelso. And it was found sometime around 1747, one of the earliest finds to come out of the Scottish landscape and still survive today, found in digging a well. This you might fantastic piece of Celtic art. And yet it's exactly such wet places where powerful objects were deliberately buried. Now, this wasn't for safekeeping. You don't drop an object in a spring and hope to get it back again. These were being placed deliberately in parts of the landscape that people at the time thought were special or sacred. You didn't leave your valuable objects lying around in settlements. You put them in places where you could speak another world. And in doing so, in making this sacrifice, of course, you're also showing your power, showing your importance to the onlookers as you give this wonderful bronze armlet to the waters. For this was no ordinary object. This is a piece of fantastic Celtic art, but it's also lived a long and interesting life. You'll see the terminals are truncated. It's been trimmed and refitted for a different owner, a slight twist on it. Probably a man's arm many, many times. For this was not made in the borders. This has travelled well over 100 miles from northeastern Scotland, where this style of Celtic art, so-called massive metalwork, was the dominant style in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And in fact, the niceties of this particular object show that it comes from the area around or just north of Aberdeen. Marriage alliances. It emphasises for us that these people were not isolated. Iron Age folk of the borders were connected into a wider world. So when you look at something like the Stichel armlet, when you admire it in the display, think of the stories embedded in it and the connections of this complex society. And keep your eyes open, because the antiquarian sources tell us that 2 are museum today. So watch the borders antique shops just in case there's a funny looking candelabra lying around somewhere. So what should be my second choice? Well, thinking about Trimontium, we have to think about the army. The army are fundamental to the story. They're the raison d'etre for the occupation of Trimontium. But what to choose? The site is objects that are famous across the whole of Europe to suit scholars. Well, the object I've chosen is a curious one. It's a lingering puzzle. And it's the aspects of that puzzle I want to disentangle tonight, because puzzles are fun. Puzzles make us think. These fragments of brass were found by the workmen when they were excavating the headquarters building, the late phase of the headquarters building. The curves and the strips and the rivets, and he felt they fitted together to form a kind of body arm. That remained the interpretation till the 1970s, when H. Russell Robinson of the Tower of London argued instead they came from a thigh guard, and he made this wonderful reconstruction, suggesting this is how the fragments fitted together. This is ingenious, spoiled only by the lingering problem that there are. It was only in the 1990s when Mike Simpkins and then subsequently Mike Bishop and Peter Connolly looked again at the material. And Mike and Peter looked at it because we were thinking at that stage of the displays that we were redoing in Edinburgh for the Museum of Scotland. I wanted to get the best current views on what Roman armour should look like for the displays. Mike and Peter came up and scratched their heads and gave us some great ideas for our display. And Peter also, what you see here is that very reconstruction now in the collections of the Trust and going and display in the new museum. Peter was one of the great scholars of Roman armour, but he wasn't just a scholar, he was a practical craftsman. So his solution to how this arm guard could have looked is a fascinating one. Well, we managed to get part of the arm guard on display in the museum in Edinburgh. You'll see the upper half of it, but time constraints and conservation constraints meant that So when the idea of revising the Trust display came along, it was altogether too tempting to vanish back into the drawers of the store cupboard, look back at the fragments and see what we could put together from those. And in a painstaking process of examining the fragments and trying to see what would stick together, gradually the form of the lower part of the arm guard began to be revealed. And thanks to the efforts of our articulate these brass fragments into something like how they would have looked, a critical part of the armour of a Roman infantryman, preventing sword cuts damaging his arm. And it's a wonderfully flexible form of armour. But most of them are of iron. In fact, there is an iron one from Trimontium itself. What makes ours exceptional is that it's made of copper alloy. Two other examples known from the whole Roman world. Some, to be honest, rather scabby fragments from Corbridge in the north of England, but interesting nonetheless, I wouldn't wish to gainsay them, and a much more impressive piece in the lower Rhine from Telesteinigungshof, now in the Landesmuseum in Bonn. Although this only preserves the lower half of the arm guard, ours has the complete thing. So it's the best preserved brass arm guard known from the Roman. Next of it is an infantry armour. In that sense, it needs to be seen alongside the other exceptional piece of armour from Newstead, which is the Lorica segmentata, the legionary body armour, also found in the headquarters building. So part of the same phase, part of the same set of equipment. And yet, legionaries were exceptional in Roman Scotland. Most of the actual frontier policing and frontier fighting edges of the empire and drummed up to serve in the Roman army. And although I'm pushing my limit of 10 here a little bit, I want to sneak in a little bit about the cavalry as well. And here we see Peter Connolly's wonderful evocation of a Roman cavalryman in his armour. The problem with cavalry is all the various trappings of a horse are near impossible to understand unless you're a seriously nerdy. I'm sneaking in here is a wonderful statuette of a horse. Now, this isn't from Newstead. This comes from the Roman precursor of Frankfurt in Germany and is on loan to the Trust thanks to a generous arrangement with the private collector, Holger von Grave. And we're very grateful to him for the material he's allowed the Trust to display for the Roman military displays. Because this little horse, for me, evokes the cavalry. It allows you to pieces that would once have made up the spectacle of a Roman cavalry soldier. The elite among the frontier troops, and they made that status very, very visible with the trappings of brass and silvered fittings which would have glinted on their horses as they rose past. Now, this wasn't all just about looking good, this was also about shock and awe. A cavalry soldier in full gallop would gleam, as well as the glint of the sword in his hand, would have made him a formidable opponent. And it will be a treat for those who get along to see the museum, to see the range of militaria, thanks to Holger's loan here. And I can show here one wonderful cavalry helmet. It looks decorative, but this is functional. This is what functioning cavalry helmets would look like. Very, very effectively designed, serving to show off the wearer's status, and with elements in the decoration that are also trying to evoke the power and the protection of the gods in among them. So the military equipment from Newstead sits in this wider context of the militaria of the Roman world. And it gives us this wonderful vision of the Roman army at its absolute peak. And yet, and one of the long-running problems of studying Roman frontiers is people get so fixated on the squaddies. And yet they're not alone. There is a whole military community in these sites, as David Simon's wonderful reconstruction shows, and as the finds show us as well. And little is more evocative than the shoes of the abandoned garrison. High fashion on the frontier, they also tell us about the people. These are not just men's shoes. As you can see from this selection that are being installed in the museum, we have men's, women's, and children's shoes. The whole range, the whole family are ensconced in the garrison here. This is not just a fort, but a garrison town. And round about the fort, we have the families living in the merchants and the traders and the craft workers and the drinking dens and the brothels and the fast food joints. This is an absolute hub. It's like gala on a Friday night. It will be humming with activity. The shoes are marvellous. As you can see from the one at the back, it's literally been worn through. You're seeing the imprint of a long dead soldier's foot there. You're also seeing the way that here, these fashions spread really quickly around the Roman world, and not just in the visible, but the invisible. I've shown the right here one of the shoes we have on display in the museum in Edinburgh with this highly ornate pattern of hobnails, which is as much for decoration, for the pleasure of the soldier or the wearer, if you like, as it was for function. The organics breathe life into the story of the site, and the only which Carl excavated. Organics like leather and wood and textiles only survive in two possible circumstances. One, when things are very, very dry, and two, when things are very, very wet. And it doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to work out what's likely in Scotland. So the fact that these shoes were put into the wells, were dumped in the wells, and the wells stayed waterlogged to preserve them, giving us this much richer picture of life at the site. In Edinburgh, you can see things like this wonderful horse cap, this chamfer, beautifully decorated, as well as being a functional piece of armour to protect the horse's head. It's also wonderfully decorated. On the right here, you can see brass studs outlining part of the decoration of a vinyl. So without the organics, we would be blind. The organics breathe life into the picture of the frontier, and they're one of the key Trimontium. How can I follow that? I follow it with a slight embarrassment, to be honest. This is a beautifully preserved Roman iron lamp, one of the finest from anywhere in Roman Britain. The waterlogging in the wells didn't just prevent the leather from rotting, it also stopped iron from rusting. Now, we've been working with the great scholar of Roman ironwork of this generation, Professor Bill Manning, to prepare a catalogue of the ironwork from Newstead. And Bill said to me one day, I'm almost through the ironwork. Where's the lamp? And I had to admit, I didn't know. I'd never actually seen the lamp. And this set me scurrying off to our stores to discover that in a previous preserved, it couldn't possibly be Roman. It had ended up in our post-medieval collection. It is Roman. Don't worry, it was found in one of the pits and we have now rescued it. And it will be going on display for the first time for a very, very long time in the new displays in Trimontium. I show here Marion O'Neill's wonderful drawing of the lamp. And this gives you an idea, the fact that she's drawn the spike vertically, gives you an idea or tuck into a wall so the lamp could hang at an angle over whatever you were doing or whatever you were writing. And within this iron holder, you could either place a clay lamp or you could have a wick hanging over the edge of it with olive oil or something similar, lighting the interior of, say, the commanding officer's house, or something like that. It's a wonderful hint of the architecture and the fittings and the furnishings. To ease my embarrassment and be able to finally to get it on display. But we're also bringing further illumination to the displays. A puzzle piece, a piece that turned up in field walking by Jack and Caroline Cruikshank, and one of the great treasures of the Trimontium collection is not just the Curl excavations, but all the work that field walkers have done over the years, from the Mason brothers. Finds that turned up from Jack and Caroline's collection was this curious piece of orange terracotta. Burrowing in the stores revealed there was a second piece at the top here that turned up in the Curl excavations but hadn't been identified. And after an extensive amount of head scratching, I realised it was part of a lamp. What you have is the back, is the handle portion of the lamp. Now, ceramic lamps of this form are very rare. In fact, of the style, leaf shaped with decoration, there are only two. They're both from Trimontium, which strongly suggests this is a local product. This is being made in the kilns of Trimontium to serve the needs of the soldiers and the wider community. It's an early example, if you like, of the industrial estates, the local enterprise parks that were springing up around the forts. Because these forts couldn't be reliant on long-distance supply chains. This takes us to my fifth item, a small, broken fragment of pottery. And yet, pottery is fascinating. For some, pottery is fascinating, because among the boxes and boxes and boxes of shelves from the site, there are pieces that really help to illuminate the story. Is the supply system. The Roman army might have been the best fighting machine in the ancient world, but an army without supplies is an army that will starve. So keeping your army, keeping your troops supplied was a fundamental part of what was going on to keep Roman Scotland, Roman Trimontium secure. An army without food is an army that will rebel, and no commanding officer wants a rebellious soldiery on his hands. Here we have a typical Roman style of grinding bowl with stone set into the base of it, which you could use to prepare herbs and spices and salt. It's a typical part of Roman cuisine, a key part of Roman life. Sometimes they're stamped. And they are stamped by the manufacturer effectively as an advertising tool. You can see on the one on the right, there are traces of a stamp here. What I want MI, an abbreviated name, Emilius or Eminus or something similar, and all the stamps of that name cluster round about Newstead and the adjacent area of southern Scotland. This, it seems, is a Newstead product made on the site to supply the needs of the soldiers. And this is a specialist kind of pottery. This would have been made by a specialist craft worker coming north. And it was obviously also a valued, because you will see its owner has carved their name into Virianus or something similar. It's quite hard to decipher, but it showed they were concerned enough about it to make sure that one of their messmates didn't just wander off with it. They wanted to make sure that they didn't lose their valuable mortarium. And I love these kind of things. Inscribed on his valuable possession. And I love the clues that these things give you to frontier life. Clues you can see also in this other sherd of a mortarium. But this one was never functional. The cracking that you can see here and the spalling there showed that it was a second. It was a reject from the kilns around the site, dumped and thrown away until it was found in Currell's excavation. And how did the Roman army stay in Scotland? How was it able to sustain itself? So local supply is a key part of it. Some things can't come locally. The borders may be a wonderful agricultural area, but wine and olive oil are in short supply, it's fair to say. And so amphorae, this example here, containing olive oil from the south of Spain, wine from Spain and France, were brought up on long-distance supply networks and brought in as ballast from the lower Rhine, but also because they are some of the best quernstones known in the Roman world. The kind of lava that they had in the area around Koblenz, around Niedermendig, meant that it was a wonderful, hard-wearing quernstone. And the soldiers loved these things. The quern I show you on the right, the quern pear, is one of the best preserved from Roman Britain. And it was installed in the exhibition on Tuesday. It'll be there for you to see. Pottery and the querns do is not just tell us about the supply networks, they act as a traitor die. Pottery doesn't travel alone. Pottery can make these networks visible. So this selection of material here comes from left to right, Severn Estuary, the Nene Valley, the Thames Estuary, and Gaul. And they show us something of the networks that kept the Roman supply system going. It's a combination of the local things that soldiers had, the wider networks keeping the supplies going. But if I could sneak another find in at this point, it would be this one. One of the least impressive finds that will be going on display. It's a battered fragment of a Roman brooch, found by Billy Butler metal detecting at Fallanow near Oxon. Originally, it would have looked like this item top left, or rather, it was intended to look like this item top left. Our example is unfinished. This is a casting seam, and this area here, where the spring would have gone, has never been perforated. What makes it interesting is it doesn't come from a Roman site. It comes from a local farmstead right beside the Roman road. And it reminds us again that this was not an empty landscape, that this invasion by the Romans brought both threats, existential threats. This was an unfriendly. There was a chance to get access to Roman prestige goods or to deal with the Roman market. So Rome, as both opportunity and threat, is a story of this battered wee fragment can tell us. So we must remember this with the army. Remember the supply, remember the landscape and the people who are in it already. Now for me, one of the things I've most enjoyed back into the stores and puzzling over objects. And these four objects here remain a puzzle. They are linked to some kind of exotic bronze vessel, but they're very, very hard to parallel. The nearest I can find is something like this. And this comes from a graveyard, a cemetery at Veringen in southern Germany. It's a fluted bowl that would have been used for washing the hands at the table before you feasted. This is the best parallel I can find for these things, which have been deliberately removed from the vessel before it was buried. And they're a reminder of the elite of the Roman world who are serving as commanders in the Roman folk. We see those elite in other vessels. Among the displays we have in Edinburgh is this wonderful wine jug with the head of Bacchus, the god of wine, at the base of it. Now, of course, the Romans don't drink wine. And so where there is wine, there is water. And the displays in Trimontium will be showing this handle here, which I had fondly assumed was a wine jug handle when I first fished it out of the displays, out of the stores. How wrong could I be? The scaly pattern, an odd thing for a wine jug, might have given me cause to think. And in fact, the overall head, the shape of the head, is intended. And the form is well known. It comes from these kind of things, which are a form of water jug often found with wine to serve alongside on the officers' dining tables. So these bronze vessels evoke the world of the Roman elite, but the bronze vessels also remind us of the soldiers. The officers may have had their food cooked for them by slaves or servants. The soldiers were cooking for themselves. Series of these hand-hammered vessels from the site. This is one that's been on display with the Trust for many years, but it was only recently I noticed a puzzle about it. At the bottom of one side are traces of a fitting, which seems to have been some kind of tap, a spigot of some sort. I have no idea what it's for. You don't normally get these things on camp kettles, so-called. All I can think of drain material out of, perhaps even to act as a water clock or something similar. And it's a reminder of how even apparently well-known objects can give us an awful lot of information. We just go back and look at them again. Another of the unsung treasures, which I'm sneaking in under this rubric, are these two odd vessels that are all found in his excavations in the inner ditch, but vessels of lead, not of bronze. And these are very, very rare indeed. Only a handful of parallels from across the Roman world. Sometimes you find them in shrines. There's a really nice set which were found in a shrine in Rome at the Fountain of Anna Perenna, which seemed to have been used to contain offerings. They are also found occasionally in burials, and contain the remains of cosmetics preserved inside it. And the most likely explanation of these is they contained medicine or cosmetics or something you wanted to be preserved. We've taken samples from these. The initial results, looking for the inorganic components, for example, paint, have come back negative. We still have the samples to run on the organic side of things in the hope it might give us more clues about what these once contained. But at the moment, they serve as a reminder of vessels on the frontier, and a reminder also of these other things you use vessels for: medicines, cosmetics, perfumes. Perhaps even paint pots. Sometimes get lead vessels used for paint. So the puzzles of vessels, one of the other things I find fascinating in going back into this material to disentangle it. I've talked a lot about people, but we've met now to one of the surviving inhabitants of Roman Trimontium. Curl found a number of human remains in his excavations. Sadly, none of these survive today. They went into the collections of the anatomists and never, it seems, reappeared. We're still on the hunt, but frustratingly, they haven't yet reappeared. And this is really annoying because we can now do so much more with human remains than was possible in Curl's day. The skull, I should when the railway was put through the site, and the railway, which is the line of which was taken for the Melrose bypass, and you can see it on the bottom of the first edition map here, along with mentions of Roman altars being found, and here the discovery of bronze pottery and animal remains. Now, it wasn't just pottery and animal remains. The early accounts describe rather excitedly the discovery of a skeleton, apparently spanning the head of which is shown here. So it seems to have been a burial. Curl republished the sword. It gets discussed as a likely Roman burial, and this too has come under the eyes of Bill Manning. And Bill has raised some concerns. The form of the spear is an unusual one. It's not the kind of thing you'd expect on a Roman frontier fort. Not entirely unparalleled, but odd. A happier home for it would be in a later context, in an Anglo-Saxon burial. And burials with weapons are also much more of an Anglo-Saxon habit. They're not really a Roman habit. There are puzzles, therefore, to go with this skull. And there is other Anglo-Saxon material from the site. Well, luckily, of course, we can now find ways to solve this problem. The process take a tiny sample of the skull and send it off for radiocarbon dating. We are eagerly anticipating the result. Is it going to be a very rare Roman weapons burial? Or is it going to turn out to be Anglo-Saxon? In which case, I will need to email esteemed Herr Dr. Professor Thomas Fischer, formerly of the University of Cologne, and ask that he pops all of his otherwise very, very splendid and worthwhile book on the Roman military equipment of the empire, because the front cover. So which part of Trimontium's story does this skull fit? We know that it's a male, a mature adult in his 40s, but we're able to do so much more with this material now. So samples have also gone away, which will help to tell us about his diet, which will help to tell us, was he born and bred in Trimontium, or did he come from elsewhere? And which will also tell us about his hair colour and his eyes on tenterhooks. We may be trying to tell the latest story in the new displays, but this story will continue changing as puzzles like this get resolved. Good stories never finish. There are always new things to uncover. And as we've seen, some of these puzzles have been with us for a while. So for number 8, I take a find again from the 19th century. Trust's display, thanks to the generosity of Liv Borders, published by James Curl's brother Alexander Curl in 1905, but never fully studied. A curious hoard of bronze vessels. I had my eye on this for a while because there were stories to tell from this. And thanks to the generosity of Liv Borders, we were able to get hold of the material in advance of display to see what new stories we could tell. And I've spent a very pleasant few weeks trying to. And I can tell you a bit about these results tonight, because the many fragments are not how they originally went into the ground. It was discovered in digging a drain at Rupert's Law, which is southwest of Hawick, in the 1840s, 1850s. But the damage was the result of the drain digging. The damage was not how they went into the ground. And we can piece the fragments together into a set of Roman feet. dish, a version in bronze of common forms in pottery, but the bronze marked it out as something special. A bronze basin. And the drawings here by Alan Braby gave you a sense of how it would once have looked. This is around 35 centimetres in diameter, and it would have been used for washing your hands at the feast, similar to that puzzle piece we saw earlier. A feast that would have been accompanied with water and wine. This wonderful jug handle, and I show you on the right the decoration of two children with animals, and on the left the swan's heads that once grabbed the neck of the vessel. The eyes of the children were inlaid with silver. This was once a highly prestigious vessel, although the fact it's so worn shows that it's been treasured and used probably for 100 years or more. Now, it's really difficult to evoke this in a display, but thanks to the mounts, many of these vessels are re-emerging from the fragments, and I was delighted to see this jug taking its original form. So too of the Roman standard army cooking pots. 3 of these trulli, which are the kind of vessels that the Romans soldiery would have used for cooking and also for serving wine. And the drawing on the left reconstructs, thanks to the destruction. And I want to draw your attention to the top one, because while these were used for both cooking and for heating wine and other drinks, this one has got decoration, which is a stylized staff of Bacchus, suggesting this particular one was used for wine heating, preparing drinks for the feast. I spent a lot of time staring at these, but apparently not long enough, because just last week, my colleague Hubert, what are the funny scratches for, Fraser? What scratches, I asked. These scratches down here. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing else, but I'll just have a look at them just in case. And under the microscope, the scratches resolved into letters. 3 letters from the initials of a previous owner, A-T-E. The classic which marks the owner out as a Roman citizen. For one pair of hands that were using this, we at least have his name or his initials left behind. So the hoard is a fascinating one. And here we see Alan Braby's reconstruction. This is taken from the artist's drawing board. You can see the tools of the trade round about. To give you an idea of how this would once have looked, it was all buried within a cauldron, and there was also a gridiron. So you're seeing here the tool used for over 100 years. But there's a puzzle piece. These 2 objects down at the front. And they give us a really important clue. These fittings from a Roman military scabbard of a style typical of the late 2nd century. At Trimontium, they turn up in the latest levels from the 180s. So they date the hoard at the earliest, its burial, to the very end of the 2nd century, the end of the Roman occupation of Scotland. And the one on the right was deliberately snapped. This is not accidental breakage, it's been removed and snapped. Perhaps symbolic of the end of somebody's military service? And why were they at Rubersall? This is not a Roman site. Here we see the site, a lovely aerial photograph by Historic Environment Scotland, with a view to the distant Yield. It's the time of James Currell that there was a signal station on the site. There is no evidence of this. The blocks of Roman stonework are most unlikely from a signal station. They are built into the rampart from a Roman building, but whether this was, for example, a temple on the site, or whether it's taken from a structure some distance away, we just don't know. So was this a Roman temple? Were these buried as an offering? Was this a local? or loot? Was it the possession of somebody serving in the Roman army? There are still many puzzles to resolve, but when they go on display, you will see for the first time the splendour of this magnificent world. We're drawing to an end now. I only have 2 slots left to fill. And anyone who's heard me speak before will know the really exciting finds in recent years from the borders. There have been a number of hoards of Roman silver coins, denarii, found by local metal detectorists. And this is one found in 2011 by Jim Middleton, which is jointly owned by the Trust and Live Borders. These coins have a story to tell. And whenever a coin hoard comes up, I always try to go out and excavate to see if we can tell more about the setting of it. But since of other coins, and also were able to show, while there was nothing else in the immediate vicinity, it's right beside an Iron Age site. These are Roman coins that have come into Iron Age hands. And they are, in that sense, part of a wider pattern. Because in the decades after the Romans withdrew from the Antonine Wall in the 160s, rather than using military force, they start using coin hoards from the area north of Hadrian's Wall in exactly this period. Now, of course, parts of this stayed under Roman military occupation. The southern part still sees occupation into the 180s. Newstead isn't abandoned until the 180s. But they're not just using soldiers, they're using silver to try to maintain peace on the frontier. And we saw this really vividly in excavations here at Burnley in Murray, far beyond the reach where coins were buried, both containing just over 300 coins, buried just a few years apart, which looked to me like instalments, payments, bribes over a number of years from the Roman world. Well, we can now say more. We can now see how Roman politics evolved. We can see how under Antoninus Pius there's only a very thin scatter of material. But we can see when the Antonine Wall is abandoned, silver into central Scotland, because this was the trouble spot. The groups known as the Caledonians and the Maiatai were kicking off in this area, and the Romans pile silver into this area and also into the borders and the Lothians as a way of building a buffer zone, trying to buy friends and buy off enemies. Under the Emperor Severus, the Roman army moved north as the campaigns, which we'll hear about shortly, engage up the east coast. But when the Romans pull out again, the coins move south again. And we see instead an attempt to build a buffer between Hadrian's Wall and the lands to the north. Silver being used as a tool of diplomacy, a way of building alliances with these groups for whom silver became a status symbol. You couldn't spend this money, but you could use it to show off, a prestige indicator of your links to the Roman world. And the display of something is going to be spectacular. It already was in the existing displays. And the masterwork that Victor West is working on this is going to make this a spectacular centrepiece once more of the new displays. So how can you beat silver? The smallest find and display, and yet the most magnificent. The gemstone showing the face of the Emperor Caracalla, found in field walking on the site by Walter Elliott, one of the great field walkers of Trimontium, whose collections enrich our knowledge of the site so much. Here we see a Roman emperor from bordered soil and a man intimately connected with it. of Roman Scotland. His portrait identifies him as a young man. We can connect it to portraits of the years 205 to 209, and we know Caracalla's footsteps were on this very site. I talked a bit about the silver diplomacy, the way the Romans are using silver as they try to deal with problems. Well, in the early 3rd century, the problems impossible for the Roman world to contain, and the emperor Severus and his co-emperor Caracalla headed north with the biggest invasion army this country has ever seen. 40,000 soldiers making their slow, methodical, merciless way north. They didn't reoccupy Newstead as far as we know. The targets were further north, but they overnighted at Newstead, and the great camp the south of the fort, now invisible except from the air, was home to this invasion army. And this must be the context in which this gemstone was lost. The invasion, in a hard-eyed view of it, was a disaster. The locals had learnt the lesson: don't engage the Romans in pitched battle. Instead, they conducted hit-and-run campaigns, guerrilla attacks, and then promptly broke them. Severus himself died in York in 211 before he was able to win the great victory, and Caracalla came to terms with the barbarians. This inglorious episode didn't stop the Roman propaganda machine celebrating it as a great victory, and coins were struck to commemorate victory in Britain, with poor wee Caledonians subjected to the might of the Roman goddess. The gemstone tells us another part of this. It tells us about the internal Roman politics, the way that the emperor and their close associates kept those nearest to them loyal. A gemstone like this was a personal gift from the emperor. Much like these cameos you see here from South Shields, Marbella, one of the great campaign bases, supply bases of the Severian campaign. These would have been given to the officers. So this gemstone would have been a matter of considerable concern to the man involved. I cannot end there, because the gemstones are the great treasure of the field walking of Trimontium. And you will indulge my hope to show you some of the literal gems that will be enlivening the displays, seen here in new photography done by our wonderful photographer Neil MacLean. They give us insights into the religious world of the Romans. Here we see a Maenad, a follower of the god Bacchus, swirling in ecstasy and playing the double pipes, with the remains of the iron finger ring still surviving. Here, two cupids wrestling, one of the great sports the Roman soldiers would have enjoyed. Here, Fortuna, the goddess of fortune, in their finger ring, because she could hold the power of life and death in her hands. And here, the face of Jupiter, head god, the man who would see over everything, the man to whom altars were erected by the troops every year to make sure his thunderbolt-laden hands didn't strike them. These gemstones are one of the most remarkable collections from any frontier. And also on display in Edinburgh, gives you an idea of what these gems were once like. This is not, in fact, a Trimontium find. This one comes from Philip Hoch near Celtic, another metal detecting discovery, but I show it to give you an idea of how they were once used. Set into a ring to act as a sealed stone in wax to mark your letters, to act as decoration, and to also act as protection. To bring the eye of the gods on the people. Finds breathe life into a story. for me, and I hope for you, finds bring the frontier alive. And even in sneaking in just a few more than 10 items, this is only a taster of the stories that await. And these are not just amazing objects, these are objects that tell us about the Roman frontier and its relationship. We can only understand it from the archaeology. It is the finds that breathe life into it and the stories that the museum at Trimontium has told over the years and will now tell again in this wonderful new display, and the stories we tell in the museum in Edinburgh. Together, these help to put Trimontium into a wider setting, a setting of international importance. It's a delight to tell the story of Trimontium, but I hope I've also shown you these stories don't end. There are new stories emerging, new finds coming in, and new stories from apparently well-known objects coming up all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fraser. I think if people would like to unmute themselves and I maybe give Fraser a round of applause rather than a silent room, that would be really nice. So if you'd like to unmute and give Fraser a round of applause and share your thanks, that'd be special. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Absolutely. If I could ask you to mute yourself now. Thank you for that show appreciation, and thank you, Fraser. Fascinating talk. I could mention many of the things you said, but I love the way that you ended on Walter's finds and that link to the trust, Trimontium, to the work that Walter's done. And I've had the pleasure of meeting him 2 or 3 times in my 12, 15 months here in the Borders. Fascinating finds. Knowledgeable beyond belief, and I think when you got to your 10th object, and I know you squeezed a few more in, and it was Walter's finds, I think that tells that story between the height of the Roman Empire, the trust, and the locals here who have kind of passioned and taken the story of Trimontium on for generations. So thank you so much. Maybe we could start with a question from John, if you'd like to unmute yourself, John, and ask Fraser.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Fraser, what a fantastic talk. You've talked many times to the Trust, but that really encapsulated not just the fantastic material that we're going into the museum, it's your love for artifacts and what they mean to you in terms of interpretation from the past. So I'd like to thank you particularly for that, and also for the hundreds of hours that you've given selflessly of your time into getting us to this point with the artifacts for the display. And I think all of us are extremely grateful to yourself and to the National Museum for collaborating with us in this redisplay. So I want to say a really big thank you publicly. In terms of questions, there are loads of questions, and I've seen lots of questions coming up, so I don't want to hog them. But can I ask I suppose the big question for me, why, in your opinion, what's your gut feeling, why was there so much in the pits and wells left for Curl to find 100 years ago? What's your best guess?
This remains a very, very hot area of debate. So when Curl was publishing them, and for many years afterwards, they were seen as being the dumping of material at the end of their occupation, or the destruction debris when the fort was rapidly abandoned or come under attack. In the 1970s, people began to think, particularly Andrew Watson, but Fickham argued that actually these things had many connections with ritual deposits. When you look at other aspects of the story, the deposition of some of the could these be telling us about religious aspects? And this is a topic that Rick Jones and Simon Clark touched on as well as part of the excavations that they did on the site. And discussions have bounced backwards and forwards over this. try to remain steadfastly agnostic, because I don't think there's a single answer. One thing I would say is that what makes it exceptional is that Carroll chose to dig outside the fort. If you look at most excavations on Roman sites, people have dug. Revolutionary was this bigger picture. And in fact, Carroll knew there were other sites with similar pits. There were antiquarian records of similar pits outside Perth, for example. On the continent, Zalburg, outside the fort, there are wells filled with material. So it isn't so unusual, it's just unusual to dig it. The question then, though, is why stuff being put in? And as far as I can see, there is no single process. Some of this is the dumping of rubbish to do with religious acts. Burial of altars, for example, is not something that the Roman world would undertake lightly. So it's going to be a mixture of, if you like, the two. But this is a lawyer's answer. This is sometimes one thing, sometimes the other. That, I'm afraid, is what I think. I don't think it's a simple yes or no.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Fraser. We'll just see if we can get a couple of questions from the audience. David Breer, are you still with us? If you'd like to ask your question, you need to unmute yourself, David.
I am, thank you very much. I was interested when you were talking about the helmets, Fraser. Could any wealthy cavalryman just buy himself a helmet, or would it have to meet a sort of regimental standard, do you think?
The helmets are really interesting. There's two different styles of cavalry helmet. There's if you like, the formal functional ones, and there's what's called the parade helmet.
Yeah.
And there's the famous parade helmets and masks from the site. It seems that those are things you earn. So they're worn by the best and the bravest of soldiers. They're not being worn in use; they're being worn as part of the practice, the parade ground, if you like. But the functional helmets are also decorated. And one of the really exciting things about work in the Rhineland in recent years has been the recognition that many of the helmets had actual hair braided onto them, or representations of hair in brass. When you read Carroll's description of his helmets, it's quite clear they originally had organic elements on them as well. Now, cavalry soldiers were show-offs. Because they were the best paid of the frontier forces, the main frontier forces, because the legionaries were the best paid, but they stayed a safe distance behind the frontier. So among the frontier troops, the cavalry are the show-offs. And one of the things they use their money for is effectively blinging up their helmets. And what you can see in some of these helmets is several stages of life. A new owner, you retire from the army, you buy your material and you then sell it to the army, or you sell it on to the next owner. And you see them adding things onto it. So the famous Iron Parade helmet from the site has 4 different owners. It's got 4 different inscriptions and also 4 different modifications. So helmets didn't all need to look the same. They would look similar, but they didn't all need to look the same. And each soldier would, if you like, be customizing it.
Thank you very much. The other thing I was asking about is whether lead cups are really so rare throughout the empire, or was it just lead cups of that type?
You get pewter used, which is a lead-tin alloy, but pewter is primarily a late Roman phenomenon, not exclusive, but primarily late Roman, particularly late 3rd, 4th century, and it's mostly a British phenomenon. Cylindrical vessels of that form are really unusual. We've been looking at them for another reason. We've been looking at them from the point of view of the equivalent silver vessels in the Triprane treasure. It's something I've spoken to the Trust about before. And in trying to find parallels for that, we realise how vanishingly rare the lead examples are. If people know other examples, I'd be really keen to hear about them. But no, they are sparse. They seem to be genuinely unusual.
As usual, Fraser, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, David. Much appreciated. Is Max still with us? Because I think Max had a couple of points. One about pottery, and something about a find in the Netherlands. Is Max still with us?
I'm still here.
Oh, there you are, Max. I see you. Good. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was wondering about the pottery. Was there a particular style of pottery that was particularly popular in the Roman age? I mean, I've seen a lot of different kinds of pottery, but will there be some kind of popularity on a specific kind?
Pottery is a topic I always try to avoid and bluff my way around, and I'll need to bluff my way around this. Although the basic question I can answer is that yes, there are styles of pottery that are very common across the Roman world, but there are also very regional styles of pottery. I showed you the red glossy pottery that Samian ware, and this is made in Gaul, in modern-day France and Eastern Germany, Western Germany, and it is distributed very, very widely across the frontier provinces. This is absolutely standard in Gaul, in Germany, in Britain. You would find this style of pottery. On the frontier, it's an officer thing, an officer class material. It would mark you out as socially quite something quite special. Everyday pottery, though, tends to be much more locally produced. So most of the pots that we see below that level are either British products from further south or made in the kilns around the fort itself. However, the shapes are quite common. So if you like, there's a standard repertoire. It's like you have your equivalent of a Marks and Spencer's catalogue or an Edinburgh catalogue of pot forms, but you've been making them in a local fabric. So we see styles that are being made in the kilns around Newstead, but the same shape of pot turn up elsewhere in Britain, elsewhere on the front.
All right, thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Fraser. And Max, I think you mentioned that there was an object in the Netherlands, an interesting, was it a helmet?
Yeah, about the question from the person before me. Mm-hmm. There is a find in the Netherlands of a cavalry helmet that has a bit of organic hair left on the top of it. I don't know the exact name of it, but I do know that it was found in the Netherlands.
There's certainly some from Nijmegen, and there's a couple of really exciting recent discoveries where partly it's in waterlogged conditions, but sometimes when the metal corrodes, the corrosion of the metal effectively fossilizes the organic remains round about it, and really careful conservation can reveal that. So there was a wonderful exhibition in both Nijmegen and Bonn a few years ago where they showcased some of this material. It was originally argued it was a speciality of the Lower Rhine, of the Batavians, but we're now finding examples of it much more widely. And in fact, I'm sure that the Newstead helmets would have had similar things. One of Carol's helmets, the iron one, he even mentions an organic mass, which they boiled off to get the metal out of it. And you think, oh. So today we would be rather more careful with the conservation, but it has been the conservation of the last 10, 20 years really helped to understand this wonderful material.
Thanks, Max, for your question, and thanks, Fraser, for the explanation there. There's been some messages popped into the chat with some other finds that people might be interested in. The links are there. David's put a link in there for Castle Howard and some bronze vessels, and there's several other mentions. So if you're interested in searching other collections, please jump in and have a look in the chat. Lots and lots of messages have come in, Fraser, thanking you so much for your talk. I think you've really kind of stimulated lots of thought, lots of ideas, and fantastically lots of people saying they're going to come and visit us, which is fantastic. So again, on behalf of the trust, I'd just like to thank you for tonight, of course, and all the input and support to the project. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up tonight. Over 100 people tonight. We stayed steady at over 100 people, so great audience from spread around the globe. So thanks again, Fraser. Thanks everyone for turning up. And if you would like to see a recording of the talk, that will be available shortly along with the other talks on the Trimontium website. And we hope that we can see as many of you as possible as we open up on the 2nd of August. Thanks everybody.
Thanks very much, Fraser.
Thanks, Fraser.